A Tall and Small Collection, Season 2, Chapter 25. Ambushed. It was an odd sensation. After the sickness passed, Soren and his brothers were, unexpectedly, welcomed warmly. It had been just over 2 weeks since they began their efforts in helping the community. They distributed medicine and the broth throughout the community, and very soon, many of them were back on their feet. Ashlyn did have to call the building manager, who had the suspected room inspected. Thankfully, there was no need for an invasive search of the walls because, according to their tests, the opened bedroom window in that one apartment was the primary source, and it hadn't spread to any other of the apartments in the building. It was a miracle, to say the least. And other than the filters and the specific apartment walls needing new insulation and a thorough clean, the rest of the building was fine. Everyone, especially Soren, gave a huge sigh of relief, and they weren't the only ones. The rest of the community was thrilled the sickness was over. Something like this happened many years ago, but not to such a severe state. Now that the illness had passed, Soren noticed that the others recognized him and his brothers as the quote-unquote medicinal daredevils of the building. The past 3 times they went to the market with various borrowings of medicine and broth from Ashlyn, they were congratulated and thanked, even invited to dinner by a few families. For habitually solitary and isolated beings, the borrowers here really came together and lived up to the reputation they had created as a community. It wasn't the reaction Soren expected, but he couldn't be disappointed at the result. Either the borrowers of the community didn't suspect where or how they obtained medicine and food that wasn't expired, or they knew and chose to ignore it. Whatever the case, Soren was beyond grateful and was not about to question their recent good fortune. At any rate, he had a lot of things on his mind and decided to take full advantage of it while he had the home to himself. He worked on chores of the house as his mind toiled over recent events and thoughts churned in his mind. Dorian spent the night at Tyron's house. Ray was walking the halls with Maisie. Ashlyn was... She was at work. Soren knew working for a human was important, but why did it have to take so much time? He wanted her to be home so they could talk about everything and nothing. Why? No, Soren shook his head free of his thoughts. Why did he even want this? Well, he suspected why, but no, it was ludicrous. But it was getting harder to deny. Besides, they were so different. But were they really so different? Soren was startled out of his thoughts when he heard a firm set of 3 knocks on his front door. What was this about? They'd never had visitors before. No one other than the Rafters family should have known where to find them, right? Soren cautiously approached the door and listened. Perhaps it was just the sound carrying from the apartment below. "Anyone home?" called a voice from just outside the door. Soren didn't recognize the borrower's voice. "Hello? You home? I'm friends with the Rafters. Just wanted to say thanks." Something didn't quite set well with Soren, but stranger things had happened recently. Soren was about to reach for the door when, wham! The door suddenly burst inward, practically tearing it from the wall. The door had been kicked in, and before Soren could even flinch, a fist collided with his jaw. Soren, by some miracle, was still conscious, but couldn't stop himself from tumbling to the ground. He barely made it to his feet when the wind was kicked out of him by the brunt side of a leg. 3 borrowers Soren didn't recognize stepped across the threshold and stood over him. heart thundering in his chest and lungs desperate for breath. Soren coughed and forced himself onto his hands and knees. One of them was scarred and burly, obviously one of the lifters or carriers of the community. He had dark hair, and Soren didn't recognize him, but the scars were distinct. This was the one who had hit him. The other two had a body type more like Soren's, lean and flexible. There was undoubtedly power behind those fists. One of them had light brown hair that was pulled back into a partial ponytail, and either side of his head was shaved. The other was also dark-haired, but his pale blue eyes reminded Soren of Brady's eyes. Soren couldn't think about that now. He had to do something, anything, to subdue his attackers. What do you want? He asked between forcing in air, choking back his gag reflex. Maybe getting them talking would give him an advantage. At the very least, it would give him a temporary reprieve from whatever these three had in mind. Just take what you want. What we want? Easy for you to say, pet. Spat the lean, dark-haired one as he stepped over to Soren and grabbed a fistful of Soren's hair and wrenched his head backward. Soren, thrown into shock from everything happening all at once, suddenly knew what this was all about. Ashlyn and their family. Was there any sense in trying to deny it to them? Soren had to try something. He reached up and seized the hand that had gripped him and tried prying it off of his scalp. That's not how it is, Soren said through gritted teeth. Oh, that's right, you've been brainwashed. You can't think for yourself anymore. Let that human do the thinking for you, right? Chimed in the scarred borrower as he came through and tipped one of their tables over, knocking the contents onto the floor. So tell us, how does it work? You tell your owner about where we live and where to find us, and she leaves your family alone? Asked the guy with the light brown hair as he began poking through the cupboards and storage shelves in their kitchen. Soren gritted his teeth as they grabbed him and began dragging him further into his home. Get off me, growled Soren. We didn't do anything to you. No? Asked the one as he wrenched Soren's arm behind his back, pinning him to the ground. You sure? You told that human where we were. You told that human we were sick and defenseless. You had the audacity to all but announce where your loyalties lie, and it is with those humans. You realize what could have happened if those humans had gone into the rest of those apartments? Into the walls? We would have been exposed for sure. What then? Demanded the other as he found the storage crate for Soren's borrowing supplies and began to pull out the rope and hooks. Soren's chest felt like it was going to explode. He struggled against the grip, but was only wrenching his arm within its socket. Ashlyn wouldn't have let that happen, spat Soren. No? Wham! Soren received another harsh punch to his side on his back. The fist drove into his ribs and into his lungs, making him gasp. She's the one who called him in the first place, right? You sure have a lot of faith in that human of yours, said one of the borrowers. Let me ask you, why are you pretending to be a borrower? You stay down there with that human. You eat and sleep down there. You've been spying on us? Grimaced Soren, as he tried to struggle again against the grip that had him pinned down to the ground. You and your whole family, continued the one, as he got right up in Soren's face. You're not borrowers, you're pets, and all good pets need a cage. Soren? Soren's heart dropped into his stomach as all eyes turned to the door to see Ray standing there with Maisie by his feet. Both of them looked terrified. In that moment, Soren could only think of protecting them. Ray, get out of here! Run! Protect Maisie! Shouted Soren before receiving another harsh blow to the back of his head. Ray had seen something like this before, when Soren was pinned beneath the mousetrap. He didn't want to leave his brother, but there Ray's instincts kicked in. He seized Maisie and ran into the darkness of the halls. For a brief moment, One of the assailants took a few steps toward the door before Soren thrashed against his assailant's grasp. "Don't! Just leave my family alone! Leave them alone!" shouted Soren, another harsh punch directly into his spine. "Oh, we will. We'll leave them alone for now. But they're pets too." This was bad. This was really bad. It was beyond clear. They wouldn't see reason. Nothing Soren could say would stop what was about to happen. The only thing he could do was attempt to defend himself. "You know nothing about us, so shut up about my family!" Soren knew it was going to hurt, but there was nothing else he could do. Soren twisted his arm out from under his body and reached up, grabbing the hand that had a fistful of his hair, and dug his nails into his attacker's flesh. He exclaimed in surprise, and for an instant his grip slackened. That was all Soren needed. Soren twisted his body around and raised up, cracking his skull against his assailant's head and busting his nose. He cried out in surprise and reared back, letting go of Soren's other arm. In a flash, Soren pried himself off of the ground and kicked out. His foot collided with his assailant's leg, and instantly the borrower crumpled. Soren was back in the game. He stood and lunged at the nearest intruder, grabbing him around the collar and throwing him against the wall. The borrower's elbow snapped to the side and clocked the deep bruise forming on Soren's jaw, but Soren held firm and landed a few blows to the gut and the eye before he felt himself being grabbed from behind again. Soren wrenched around and punched out, landing one single blow to the last borrower's face just in time for him to receive 2 harsh knee kicks to the gut. Once again, Soren was thrown to the ground. In that moment of recovery, Soren's attackers grabbed either arm and pulled them tight. They kicked his knee out, leaving him kneeling with his arms behind his back. Soren's small victory was short-lived, but the blows he delivered would be hard to explain to the community. All 3 of them glared at Soren, but the grin of their leader's face made Soren's insides churn. "Gents, I think he needs to cool off." Soren only remembered a harsh pain to the side of his head before everything went black. An unimaginable, frigid cold was the next thing Soren remembered when he opened his eyes. He was in a freezing, pitch-black place. His limbs were stiff. Everything hurt, the bruises in his body, his hands and feet. What was this place? Soren forced himself upright and felt around. The ground was slick. He reached out and touched the floor and the cold substance. Instantly, his body went rigid. He knew what this was. Ice. A knot formed in the pit of Soren's gut. He knew exactly where he was placed. He forced himself to stand and limped forward toward a wall, any wall, and pressed his hands against it. Sure enough, there were ice crystals on the wall. Those traitors. They put him in the freezer. How? How long was he unconscious? How did they get him down? There were 3 of them, but had they really gone through all of that effort just to put him in here? Soren shivered violently and pulled his limbs close to his chest. It was so painful to move. How long had he been in there? Soren knew that freezing temperatures were dangerous, even deadly. Borrowers were durable and could survive in a lot of conditions longer than humans, but not a lot longer. Soren tried pacing back and forth, but it soon became unbearable to move. Shivering, he sat near where he suspected the entrance was and kept his arms and legs close to his chest. There was no way out. There was nothing he could do. He was trapped, and he could only hope that someone would find him in time. But who? Ray was protecting Maisie. Wait, the boys. Maisie. They were going to be next. Soren gritted his teeth and hoped that, if nothing else, they would be safe and stay hidden long enough for Ashlyn to get home. But when would that be? Ray watched it all happen. He ran to one of the cabinets by the kitchen that let him see both the living room and the kitchen clearly. He had to use his emergency hook to belay off of one wall and practically fly to the ground, Maisie in tow. The stinging heat along the middle of his palms told him he had a terrible rope burn. Maisie was crying, and Ray was shaking with adrenaline. Not only was he shaking with nerves and shock, he was shaking from a seething anger and petrifying fear. He watched, horrified, as those three strange borrowers they had never seen before carried Soren to the freezer. It took a minute for them to open the door and carry him inside, but Ray couldn't do anything but watch. How could other borrowers be so cruel? What did they want? Anything? Nothing? All he knew was he felt torn into pieces. He wanted to save Soren. He wanted to tell Dorian what was going on so he could be safe. He wanted to beat the living daylights out of those three. He wanted Ashlyn home, because despite his best efforts to stay calm and focused, Ray was one more thought away from completely breaking down. Ray focused what little energy he could spare on soothing Maisie, unable to win the debate with himself to bring her and expose their hiding place in the hopes of getting Soren free. Did he leave Maisie and tell her to stay hidden? No, she was too little and wouldn't listen. She couldn't be left alone. Besides, he didn't have the physical strength to. He had none of his gadgets to pry open the freezer door that took 3 borrowers to open it. He actually had some inventions back home, but it was probably being watched, or an ambush, or worse, it was being ransacked. So, he couldn't get to his inventions. Why was this happening? Why his family? What was going to happen now? It was then that there was a familiar jingle of keys, and the front door opened. Ashlyn was home. Ashlyn had already shown the houses she needed for the day, and the couple of cancellations meant all she needed to do was file the paperwork, and she could do that at home. It was actually a really good day. She had a surprise for Dorian's birthday, and it finally came. It was an iPod and a mini microphone she saw on one of her social media pages. It was the perfect size for Dorian. It was refurbished and discounted, but that wouldn't matter to him. It would be his. Now he could get everything set up for his music studio and not have to rely on her phone. Not that she was complaining. His stuff was good. Really good. Ashlyn could only hope other listeners thought the same thing. She got a few things for the others too. Ray talked so much about wanting to make something that could help them get around, and was fascinated with flight and space. She found just the right sized drone and remote control. Soren was a little harder to find something for, but Ashlyn had found the cutest high chair for Maisie. First things first, though. She stepped inside and set her things down, as always, and headed off to her room to begin setting up the iPod for Dorian when she heard something. It was her name, and it was being shouted from the living room, on top of the far cabinet. It was Ray, and he sounded panicked. Was something wrong? "Ray?" she called. She pried her shoes off of her feet and stepped out into the main room again to see where his voice was coming from. "Ray? Are you there?" "Ashlyn! Help!" In a fraction of a second, Ashlyn tensed, and her heart sank into her shoes. Ray sounded distraught. She searched desperately around and finally spotted him on top of the cabinet, the one at the far side of the room. He was holding Maisie, and he was shaking. Maisie was crying, and Ray looked like he was about to join her. Memories flashing back from when she first saw Dorian on the floor and Soren asking her for help flooded her mind. Ashlyn instantly rushed over and held up her hand flush with the top. Ray stumbled onto her palm, keeping Maisie close, and tried organizing his thoughts as fast as possible as Ashlyn lowered him down so she could see him. "Ray, what's going on?" asked Ashlyn. Ray was shaking, and so was Maisie. Ashlyn, they broke in!" Ray was quickly losing the order of events. "They?" asked Ashlyn, feeling her blood beginning to boil. "Ray, are you hurt? Is Maisie hurt?" Ray gritted his teeth and shook his head. He only managed to choke out one word, which instantly sent Ashlyn into a blind panic. "Soren!" It felt like the world stopped. Everything stopped. Soren? What happened to Soren? Ray and Maisie were safe, but what happened to Soren? And what about Dorian? Her heart tripled in pace, but every thought in her head instantly fixated on one thing, which was figuring out what happened. Breath congealing in her lungs, Ashlyn forced herself to think clearly and cleared her throat. "Ray, tell me what happened. Where is Soren? Is he—" Ashlyn watched as Ray shook his head over and over. "Ray!" Ashlyn said firmly to snap him out of his hyperventilating spasm. She hated to speak so loudly, and seeing Ray flinch out of his mental spiraling made her heart hurt, but it was the only way to find out what was going on. "They came in. They beat him up. They hurt him. Ashlyn, I don't know what we did wrong. I don't know what we did wrong," stammered Ray. "Ray, where is he now? Is he still in the walls?" cried Ashlyn. Freezer," stammered Ray. "Ashlyn." Ashlyn's insides churned. Her chest clenched. How long had he been in there? Now Ray and Maisie weren't the only ones shaking. Now Ashlyn was shaking too. Ashlyn wanted to sink to her knees. She wanted to bust down the walls and confront the so-called community and demand justice. All of the questions faded away into one and only one thing to do. Ashlyn hurried to the kitchen and set Ray and Maisie down on the counter, making sure no one else was there on the counter as she did, before stepping up to the kitchen appliance. Just before she opened the freezer, she saw a note scrawled on top of the refrigerator, which would have sent her into a blind rage if she weren't so scared. Pet. Hands shaking, she threw open the door to the freezer and, instantly, her heart dropped to the floor. There, laying on his side, curled up into himself, was Soren. There were ice crystals in his hair, and his skin was pale and turning blue. Even with his discolored skin, Ashlyn could see the deep bruises on his face. Where else was he injured? One other thing. He wasn't moving. No shivering. No wince with the sudden rush of light. He was still. Too still. Ashlyn didn't realize she was shaking so harshly until she reached out and laid her fingers against Soren's body, stroking him to see if there was any reaction. Ashlyn couldn't breathe. Every first aid trick she had learned was out the window. It felt like her world stopped as she stared at Soren's bruised body. She carefully pressed her fingers into his back and lifted up. There! A wince! It was faint, but it was there. Ashlyn could have jumped to the moon, she was so excited and relieved. With every ounce of control she could exert, Ashlyn carefully lifted Soren from the frozen surface of the freezer shelf and into the palm of her hand. Soren winced again and seemed to lean into the warmth, but barely stirred otherwise. Ashlyn didn't know how to cure hypothermia or even where to begin. What she did know was he needed to get his core body temperature up, and one solution immediately came to mind. She maneuvered him so he wouldn't be upside down, being as ginger as she could while moving him. Keeping Soren cupped in her palm, she pulled her shirt down just enough so she could hold him to her chest by her collarbone. One thing about hypothermia was that he needed to get warm slowly. Too quick might kill him. His skin felt like a cube of ice against hers, but she cradled him to her chest nonetheless. She closed the freezer door, revealing Ray shivering on the counter. Maisie was trying to walk around back into the walls, obviously trying to get home where she saw her dad last. Ray was wrestling with her, trying to get her to hold still, but was losing this uphill battle quickly against the determined toddler. When he saw Ashlyn close the door, however, his efforts almost stopped completely as he focused on Ashlyn for some kind of confirmation. His blue eyes searched desperately for reassurance, and one look gave him what he needed. Ray collapsed to his knees in a silent cry of relief as Ashlyn nodded and knelt. Maisie, not being fought anymore, made it 2 steps toward the electrical cover before seeing Ashlyn and toddling toward her outstretched left hand. "He's alive. Soren's alive," she choked out as she tilted her hand to show Soren tucked against her chest. "He's unconscious. It probably has hypothermia, but he's alive." Ray stumbled over and looked at his brother curled against Ashlyn's chest, resting in the palm of her hand. "Soren! Soren!" Ray shouted. He wrapped his arms around himself as he heaved in breath after breath. Maisie, on the other hand, curled instinctually into Ashlyn's palm, laying her head against Ashlyn's thumb, as if she knew her human friend would take her to where she needed to go. "It's okay. He's okay." Ashlyn said this over and over, telling Ray, and also herself. She leaned closer to the countertop so Ray could watch his brother's color begin to change from pale blue to an almost sheet white. Maisie got off on Ashlyn's hand at one point and walked over to wrap her arms around Ray's neck. Ray simply held onto his little niece, and Ashlyn slowly moved her left hand to rest near the 2 young borrowers. After several minutes, Ashlyn looked around and suddenly realized Dorian wasn't there. It felt like another hole was punched right through her. "Ray, where's Dorian?" asked Ashlyn, praying that he was hiding somewhere else nearby or that he had gone to get some materials back at home. Ray's expression instantly shifted and sank into panic and worry. Ray sniffed and wiped the gathered tears from his eyes. "He spent the night at a friend's house." "A friend?" asked Ashlyn. "Which friend?" "Hero's brother, Tyron," said Ray. Ray paused as a sudden, determined look hardened his features. I have to go and get him. I have to bring him back. He doesn't know about the attack." Ray pulled Maisie's arms off of him, stood, and began hurrying to the electrical cover on the counter. "What? Ray, you can't!" urged Ashlyn. "I have to," he replied bluntly as he pressed forward quickly to the wall. Ashlyn, in a flash, reached out with her left hand past Maisie and grabbed Ray's arm between her thumb and index finger and held him in place. Instinctually, Ray looked back to Ashlyn, eyes filled with an ingrained panic all borrowers possessed, and tried to pry his arm loose. "Let me go, Ashlyn!" Ray demanded. "Ray, it isn't safe. Whoever did this thinks you all are pets. This is personal. If you were out there on your own, Dorian doesn't know what happened. Something worse could happen to him. He could be in worse condition than Soren. He needs to know, and I need to bring him home. Please, he's my brother. He's in danger," Ray pleaded. Ashlyn knew all of this was true. Dorian probably didn't know and was in danger, but she couldn't get over the sinking feeling that letting Ray go on his own would put him in worse peril than what happened to Soren. Still, the determined look in Ray's eyes told her that Ray would resent her for the rest of his life if she didn't let him do this. Dorian needed his help, and if Ashlyn didn't let him go, she would live to see it haunt her. Ray couldn't help protect Soren, even though he had guarded Maisie successfully. Ray was quick and could handle himself, but he needed to know he wasn't doing this alone. There were going to be repercussions if he didn't return. With a fierce look, Ashlyn looked into Ray's eyes to make sure he understood completely. "If you are not back in 20 minutes, I'm coming after you. Understood?" stated Ashlyn. "That's not enough time. I have to make it all the way to the elevator shaft and everything," argued Ray. 30 minutes then, and I'll help you get into the walls. Where do you want to be? Breathed Ashlyn. Home. I know it's dangerous, but I have some equipment that could help if it wasn't taken, stated Ray. Ashlyn nodded twice and tilted her hand to let Ray step on, which he did in a heartbeat. Maisie also climbed on, and Ashlyn was back at the wall entrance to their place in an instant. Before letting him off, Ashlyn pulled her hand down from the entrance and looked into Ray's eyes. Ray, I'm sorry for grabbing your arm. It's okay, Ashlyn, said Ray. You're trying to protect me, but right now, I need to do this. The earnest look in Ray's eyes showed Ashlyn he was telling the truth. With as much of a stiff upper lip as she could, she nodded and lifted Ray to the crawlspace entrance. 30 minutes, or I'm coming into the walls after you. Get it? Got it, replied Ray. With that, Ray jumped off of her hand and vanished into the walls. Ashlyn lowered her hand with Maisie still aboard and headed back into the living room. She placed Maisie on the couch in a tangle of blankets before pulling out her phone and typing in the best way to cure hypothermia. Hold on, Soren. Just hold on, she muttered. The timer went off 2 minutes ago. 2 minutes. Sure, Ray had another 90 seconds to go, but it was too close for Ashlyn's taste. She had pulled up every article in the meantime on hypothermia and how to best treat it. Turns out skin to skin was an effective method, but she needed to make sure Maisie was tended to as well. Ashlyn fished out a heating pad and covered it with blankets, creating a makeshift blanket tent to protect Maisie and Soren. His color was returning, and, after about 20 minutes, his eyes fluttered open to see Maisie curled against his chest and Ashlyn's hand wrapped around him. Ashlyn heard him ask something, but she couldn't tell what it was. Instead, she filled him in. Ray went to get Dorian. He should be back soon. They were safe. He was going to be all right. Soren was barely conscious for the next few minutes before slipping back into sleep. That 90 seconds came and went, and Ashlyn gave it another 2 minutes before standing and preparing to go into the elevator shaft via the emergency hatch, when she heard someone calling out from the trim by the baseboard in the living room. Ashlyn! She leapt up and practically flew to the living room from her bedroom and spotted both Dorian and Ray, though it wasn't as welcome of a sight as she wanted. Ray had Dorian's arm slung over his shoulder, and he was clutching his own arm close to his chest. Dorian was limping, but both boys managed a smile when they spotted Ashlyn. That same sickening rage blended with the relief of seeing them, created a vengeful loathing. For now, however, she decided to set it aside and fester over plans against the brothers' attackers later. Ashlyn fell to her knees and scooped up the boys to set them on her bedside table as she retrieved her medical kit. Meanwhile, the boys sat close to Soren before Ashlyn returned. What happened? She asked, as she poured peroxide over a cotton swab and gave it to them to press against their bruises and cuts. Ambushed, muttered Ray. On our way back, they chased us. They did this to you? Growled Ashlyn. Not exactly, replied Dorian. On our way back, they confronted us. They got in one good swing before we started running. They tried cutting us off, but that crazy device of Ray's saved us. We just landed a little harsher than we thought. I braced with my leg, and he braced with his arm. The device Dorian was referring to was patterned after a device Ray saw in an anime clip Ashlyn showed him. It was a hook he could shoot with a powerful spring that acted like a grappling hook, which could then help reel him back in. The rope held, but the speed of the swing down made them hit the wall hard. They braced themselves, Ray spraining his arm and Dorian spraining his ankle. They were rattled, but okay. At any rate, they were more scared about whether or not Soren was going to be all right. Ashlyn reassured them He was awake for a minute and that his color was returning. The next hour was spent bandaging the boys and making sure they were really okay before they heard Soren stir again. He was groggy, but there and aware enough to listen to Ray and Dorian's experience. They all sat together in the soft blanket tent, Ashlyn by their side, as they fully absorbed what had just happened. They were attacked, and they were attacked by their own kind, borrowers. Was this an isolated incident? Or was someone, or, more terrifyingly, a group coming after them? Would they try again? They didn't know. What they did know was, like when they were sick a few weeks ago, they would be staying down in Ashlyn's room as a group. Maisie curled into Soren's lap, and he held her tightly to his chest. They were alive and safe, which was what all mattered most. At least, that was all that mattered to the borrower boys at the moment. Ashlyn had something else weighing on her mind ever since she saw Soren curled up in her palm, nearly frozen to death. She couldn't help but think of everything that had been brewing in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but think about how she felt and how, if things had taken a turn for the worst, that he would have slipped away without knowing what was in her heart. Seeing the borrower family together kept her from saying anything, but Ashlyn knew that she had never been more terrified in her entire life for the family she knew and loved. The differences didn't matter anymore. She needed to speak her mind. He needed to know how she felt. But when would the timing be right? Would it ever be right? And was she already too late?